All right, I'm gonna pick back up. How do I make this full screen now? Yeah, I need to fix that. Hang on, just give me a second. Go away. All right, here we go. So now we're going to talk about, whereas we've covered with Newton and Galileo more the things that don't necessarily impact your day-to-day life necessarily. Like, I mean, does it really change your life, for instance? Does it really matter that much in the grand scheme of things if the earth goes around the sun or the sun goes around the earth? To the Catholic Church, it's a big deal if you want to challenge that, but it doesn't change the fact that I've got to plow the fields, harvest the crops, sell goods to survive, right? Um, Newton and physics, I mean, it doesn't necessarily matter how physics works, but now we're going to start looking at things that might actually really matter. Because at some point, unfortunately, most of us have been sick, and probably all of us will be sick at some point in our lives. Hopefully, not with COVID. Hopefully, something that we can cure. But the advances in medicine now that we start seeing from this time period start making points in lives where it really will matter for us. And the grand irony of it is, I think, in my opinion, is that these guys rarely get challenged by the church. Um, the guys who get challenged are the guys who are just looking at things that I guess I would say is definitely more academic in nature versus is it grounded in reality. Something like what I just said about the sun and the earth, but the chemicals that I can put in my body to either heal me or better strengthen me, or for that matter, learning what chemicals are wrong for my body, that does matter. That does impact me. Learning about my health and what makes my body work, that does matter. That does affect me, my children, my grandchildren, and how um, they might one day be able to be well and over something that may have harmed me. I mean, these guys are laying the groundwork for what will eventually become, a couple of generations later, the ability to do heart surgery. Um, but that's enough on that for a moment. So we've got some scientists who are starting to study the human body. They're definitely starting to do, I guess now what you would call like the getting into autopsies, but they definitely want to study the human body and figure out how does it work. In chemistry class, you may have definitely studied Boyle's law concerning. He definitely did some work concerning temperature and pressure that you certainly have studied in volume as well. Um, but he's living in this time period of the absolutes, and so just to throw out their names, what they're about. We also need to talk about women. Now, something that's coming up in history classes more and more often is the role of minorities and the role of the common person in history. We've always looked at history in the past. Remember, it's all about war and politics. It's definitely, and we still spend a lot of time talking about war and our politicians. But at the same time, there were those who still had a mark on history, but they are not about war and politics. Um, so, some examples here of women who have made their marks throughout time. Some who had to end up letting men take the credit for whatever they came up with. Um, so, what we have Margaret Cavendish. Won't talk as much about her, but looking towards getting towards a rational thought. What I really will talk about, though, is the difficulties women would have. Maria Winkleman, for instance. If you study some of these characters, you'll find that they actually made some really important scientific discoveries, but oftentimes a man got the credit for it, and sometimes the woman even had to let a man take credit just so somebody would even listen to her. So she may train somebody else to explain things for her that she actually figured out for herself, but the reality was it was her. And scientific academies at that time, for instance, here mentions of the difficulties with the Berlin Academy. I mean, a woman would be rejected just outright on the grounds that she is a woman. Certainly an outrageous thought today, but that was the nature of it. They thought that these things were too complex for a woman to understand. Um, so here we have a timeline of what's going on. One thing science will actually start to do at this time is study what is the nature of woman. And so now they're going to start looking at and challenging everything we've ever known. And one of those things is that for all of human history, women have been essentially now what you'd regard as a second-class citizen. And some of that came from, for the Catholic Church, that was grounded in Genesis. She was created to be Adam's companion in the Garden of Eden. And women are, in a religious sense at that point, the way the Bible was read and interpreted was that a woman was second to man. She was to accompany man. She was to, I guess, what would be a good word? Maybe an enhancement to man. But the man is number one. Um, and so some of this comes from the Bible as well. Remember, to be a European is to be a Christian. And although we may challenge the church, for the most part, culturally at least, even to this day, Europe is still Christian. And part of that actually comes from, for those who may have studied the Bible, the story of how the Garden of Eden fell apart anyway. It was not Adam who bit the apple. It was the serpent who didn't even try to apparently tempt Adam. Maybe the serpent knew Adam wouldn't even fall for it. But he went to the woman and said, bite this apple. And apparently the woman's just like, okay, and bites the apple. And from that point, it establishes a thought that will last for thousands of years upon this making its way into Christian culture, that a woman could be easily swayed. She could be, she was not necessarily loyal and principled. A woman could be easily swayed. As far as the sexually insatiable, that was definitely a theory that I'm not going to go into it very much here because I am teaching this in a high school environment, but I will throw it out there. If you want to go research this, look up 18th, 19th century, yeah, definitely 19th century insane asylums and why they said a woman was an insane person and what they did about it. It's crazy. There's even a couple of inventions that came out of it. It's definitely some weird stuff, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. You're going to have to go look that up for yourself. And then, while sometimes some scientists say that the things that the Bible said are now backed up by scientific thought, remember, there's also, what do you call it, confirmation bias, that you're looking for something to back up what you already believe. There were also, of course, some women who actually joined in, and some women who tried to make challenges to this. But for the most part, that women's rights is just kind of slowly advancing. It's definitely not to a point of even being remotely equal to a man yet. So here you have two things that could be kind of seen as conflicting. Some women start looking at it as spheres of influence. Could they raise a child? Could they whatever? That was one element of things. Another thing that was at one time always the domain of women was actually giving birth to children. The role of midwives was always seen as like that was an era of for women to study. Now, as we start getting into science, one way that science kind of ends up being a step back for women is actually that it now becomes a medical and scientific thing to deliver birth to a child. And then it ends up being male doctors taking over the role eventually as time goes on, especially as you start getting towards industrialization, for instance, that it ends up being a male doctor's role to deliver a child. And it actually kind of puts midwives out of business. And so, in that sense, it kind of starts reaffirming that women cannot study, women cannot be a doctor, women cannot do math. So, to some degree, science at this time kind of puts women a step back. And the story of women throughout history is definitely going to be a step forward, a step back, 2 steps forward, a step back, a step forward, a step back. And it's just constantly this back and forth, really until the 20th century when women's rights really take off in comparison to where they've been going for a couple thousand years. Hopefully that makes some sense. So here's some pictures for you to look at and enjoy. You can pause and check them out if you want. So let's talk about, as we start, now we're going to start moving away a little bit from the literal science. We're going to start moving towards philosophical thinking, and definitely sort of an academic topic, I would say. Do these things really matter in your day-to-day life? I mean, ultimately you have to eat. Now, why is that, and do you really exist, and all that doesn't seem to matter as much. You're going to at some point though have to eat. That just seems to be the reality of it. Descartes starts reflecting on, is this real? Is there a God? And he famously says the ability to rationally think and the ability to actually consider if you actually exist means you must exist. The ability to reason and not just exist is a sign that we are real, that we are thinking creatures, and even that we were created by a all-powerful and knowing God. And this is the start of a movement, which we've already kind of seen this term before, but science likes to think of itself as being rational, that we don't just believe things because we were told. I believe what I believe because I've thought about it, I've studied it, I've investigated it. I have done tests and studies to prove that what I am doing and what I believe is true. And if it can be disproven, or if I find a new way, if a new invention or a new way of thought proves to be a more rational way of going about things, a better explanation, I will accept that. So there's Descartes for you. Nice, handsome, striking man for you. And while we've been working our way to this, the modern way of scientific thought does come from Francis Bacon, who actually starts who is remember, we each scientist kind of builds on the work of the last one. And so his big contribution to life ends up being what we now follow as a scientific method, and and particularly isolating variables and investigating, which he does through a variety of projects over time. Now, he does misunderstand some of the ways Galileo went about doing things. Now, Descartes was also, in addition to be a thinker, he was also a mathematician. Most of these people do have a day job on top of that, and I want to say Rene Descartes cuts glasses for telescopes. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Please don't take me to the bank. I should research these things better before I get on the mic and start talking about them. And Newton is kind of building on what these guys are going to say. Now, you may remember this is going on alongside the study of absolute monarchs. And Louis XIV actually creates a whole academy. Now, in this case, the kings don't necessarily care about the philosophical, how's the earth and the sun work? They don't care about that sort of stuff. What they do care about is, how can you make something rationally that can improve the empire? Can you do anything that improves me and my status? So sometimes these guys might be interested in, ooh, look, science can create better weapons. Science can help me build a better palace. Ooh, nice, fun. And so they actually do commission and give some money to the study. But usually, if you're looking at what does a king or ruler study, they're definitely involved in what's practical for the kingdom. And there again, as I've reiterated time and time again, it doesn't matter if the earth goes around the sun or the sun goes around the earth. At the end of the day, I need to plant crops and harvest crops and eat. So can you do something about that for me? Can you do something about how I fight my wars? Can you improve my technology? Can you improve my ships? Can you improve my weapons? Right? Now in Greenwich, England, now this is, I want to say this is still the center of like where the time zones kind of run through, but the observatory at Greenwich is still the number one in the world. And I think I'm going to probably leave off on the next slide or so. So there ends up being, in the name of science, major observatories, or not necessarily observatories, but societies that you had to earn your way into it. You couldn't just, show up and be a dues paying member. You had to often offer something contribution. And sometimes they have informal meetings. Sometimes they're commissioned by the king. As you can see, the English Royal Society, which I want to say still exists, gets a commission from the king, and they meet several times a year. And they become formal. Now, as it starts out as an informal meeting of a few like-minded scientists, it ends up being a club that you have to earn your way into, that you have to deserve. And most every country is going to have some form of this. So there's a French Royal Academy. There's another version of this that comes out in Prussia, but I can't remember what it's called. And they are formally recognized, and they're often commissioned to do work. And they can, it may look a little bit like the example that comes to my mind. If you ever go watch Paddington Bear, the villain girl in that one movie, her dad is rejected from like a society of explorers. Um, and that's the sort of thing you would start seeing. And remember, a big focus on the recognition is more on science, but they could sometimes that work into practical fields could also get you the money or the recognition you need. And then on the side, you can start studying theoretical things. Now, over time, you could definitely make some arguments about its progress, but people start recognizing that science is the way to approach things. Like, for instance, if I want to know why does grass grow, the answer is not because God said it should grow. And I'm going to leave off on this slide for sure. People are starting to think more rationally about, or what we would now call rational, and they want to have investigations and discover. So, one thing could be, for instance, if there was a drought. Or an earthquake. The John Green video on this definitely talks about an earthquake that hits and its damage it does to a cathedral. And so whereas at one time people would say this was definitely the wrath of God or what are we doing? Now people are starting to think, well, this must be some sort of natural event. Maybe God had a hand in it, but they're also starting to think about the science behind what happens when things like there's a drought or there's a storm. We're also, remember, if we go back to our God, glory, gold idea, this is not necessarily associated with the scientific revolution, but the gold part is always something that we are after. Remember, gold is often the one true thing that everybody is pursuing throughout history. And remember that practicality side also comes down to politics. Politics is almost always associated with, when it comes to science, it's going to be associated with what's practical and how can this further extend the power of our nation. All right. So remember that idea of a different way of thinking. Whereas before, if I want to know why is the sky blue, or why is there an ocean, whereas before we went to a priest for that kind of thing, and a priest taught us everything we'd want to know about the world. Now we're going to scientists and asking scientists these sort of questions. And that's a major train of thought that we're now starting to say that the church is only for my religious and spiritual matters, and everything else I leave up to the scientists. And that train of thought is emerging at this time and is ultimately winning out. Thank you for watching.